life.
Okay, welcome. Welcome to the Degrowth Dialogues third webinar of the Degrowth and Environmental Justice Summer School, Barcelona. So this is our third webinar this year. We started last year with our webinar series Degrowth Talks, which we did in collaboration with the UK Degrowth Summer School. This year we've done 3 webinars so far. This is the third. You can check out the others on our YouTube account. And we'll be doing these right up until June, when we will have our presential summer school in Catalonia, hopefully, if COVID lets us continue doing it presentially. And so I'll tell you a little about the history of this summer school. We started 8 years ago, so this is the 8th edition. It's organized by Research and Degrowth. And this year, the title of the summer school is Alliances and Global Solidarity. And so we'll be having 2 weeks, as traditionally we have the 2 weeks. The first one will be in Barcelona, and the second one will be in Cerver, a small town in the on the border between France and Germany. So the first week will be concentrating on deconstructing different interlocking systems of oppression, like patriarchy, modernity, colonialism, the growth imperative. And we'll be looking at how, for example, environmental justice movements and social justice movements help transformative change through solidarity and alliances. And then in the second week, we'll use all this whole process of deconstruction to build on narrative building. And this will happen in Cerver, where through a sociocracy, holocracy organizing system, where students will be participating in assemblies to take decisions. We'll be experimenting degrowth in practice, let's say, and also thinking about different narratives and focusing on how important narratives are for systemic change. So our applications process is open right now. You can go on our website, and if you type in Degrowth Summer School, Degrowth and Environmental Justice Summer School Barcelona, it'll come up. I think it's degrowth.org or something, and then from there on our webpage you can start applying. We've got an application form, and we've got our programmers up there as well. And the application process will end on the 10th of April. So there's still a few more days to apply if you're thinking of applying. And that's it from the introduction on the Degrowth and Environmental Justice Summer School. And now a bit about our speakers. Today we're, I'll just get the page up in a minute. We had some technical issues at the start, so here we go. It's not loading. Choose Google Documents. Here we go. So first in line is Jennie Stevens. She's a professor of sustainable science and policy and director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at the Northeastern University in Boston. Professor Stevens' most recent work is Diversifying Power: Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. It inspires collective action with stories of innovative, diverse leaders who are linking climate and energy with jobs and economic justice, health and food, transportation and housing. Trained at Harvard and Caltech, she is an educator, social justice advocate, and internationally recognized expert on renewable transformation, energy democracy, climate justice, and gender in energy. So welcome, Jennie, and I will leave the floor to you for your presentation.
Great, well, thank you. Great to be here. And
the initial framing of this, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about my recent book that was just mentioned, and the interesting framing here that I was suggested to connect to the idea of violence. Is that still a theme? That isn't generally how I talk about my work, but so I want to connect the ideas of power and violence and how that connects with degrowth. And sorry, are you seeing the proper slides? Or are you seeing the like presenter view?
We can see, no, it's in like a little box. We can't see the full, if that's what you're trying to do, the full screen. I don't know how you would have to click on presenter view.
Okay, so let me just show taskbar. There we go. Is that better?
That's it, yeah.
Okay, great. So I want to start with thinking about economic injustice, and this is, you know, intricately linked to the idea of degrowth, because if you look here, you see the widening income and wealth gaps, and this is in the United States, but it's happening in countries around the world, and globally the trends are similar. But here you can see that just over the past 4 decades, the share of national income and national wealth of the top 1% has been increasing steadily, whereas the lower 50% and lower income folks has been declining. So, and this has gotten even worse during the pandemic, the past year. So this is completely unsustainable and leads to why we're in so many of the challenging positions we're in right now, because this is a concentration of wealth and power that is just completely unhealthy for everyone, including those who are at the top. Like they, you know, it's not good. So I want to connect the idea of concentration of wealth and power, and again, I don't usually connect it with violence, but the structural systems that have allowed this to happen is having a violent impact on communities around the world. So I think that's how I will connect with that idea. I write about and build on this idea of the polluter elite, which Dario Kenner first proposed, which are wealthy shareholders, particularly fossil fuel interests, and those who are profiting from sustaining fossil fuels, right? They're actually, most of the super wealthy people want to, and organizations want to continue their wealth and this trend of concentrating wealth and power. So they've been manipulating, using their wealth to influence our policies and our practices and our priorities in society to such a degree that they've been resisting transformation, right? And so they've actually, this group of folks, who we can call the polluter elite, have really been making strategic investments to resist transformation. And we have to acknowledge that in order to resist it and move toward transformation. And some of the ways that they've been making those investments, and this is particularly in the United States, but it's worldwide as well, the misinformation campaign to deny climate science and confuse us about the dangers of the climate crisis, and confuse us about the dangers of continuing to rely on fossil fuels. They've also made strategic investments to undermine public trust in government, pointing out that government is ineffective, can't help us, therefore we're on our own. We just have to fight for, and protect ourselves individually and not this collective. And thirdly, they have been strategically investing to resist change by minimizing worker protections and worker rights. In corporate culture, there's been a shift It used to be that companies would be proud of how they support their workers. And now corporate culture is such that you prioritize the shareholders, the elites, and then you try to minimize how much you have to support the workers, your workers, which just has led to so much this widening income and wealth gap. So when we talk about the climate crisis, we don't always focus on the economic injustices of our societies, but they're really intricately linked, because the same interests that are resisting moving toward a renewable-based future are also resisting transformation for more social justice as well, and economic justice. So I've just started to kind of think about this in terms of violence and the power. You know, I focus on power structures and these problematic power dynamics, but there's really a connection with violence when you acknowledge that political violence is often absent from discussions of power. But we know that violence does create and maintain power structures. So there are lots of different ways we can think about the interconnectedness of power and violence. Although there have been some framings to say that they're actually opposites, power and violence, rather than interconnected, but those are kind of theoretical debates about these words. But I propose that the climate crisis is really a crisis in leadership, and we need a different way of framing the climate crisis and connect it with economic justice, housing justice, health and food justice, and transportation justice and education justice in order to address the climate crisis. Because when we focus on narrow technocratic view of climate, that it's a scientific problem and it needs we need technological fixes, we are perpetuating this sense of domination and control over nature, and we're missing opportunities for connecting and investing in communities, in what people need, and actually improving the human condition. But climate isolationism and this narrow view of solving climate, including Bill Gates's latest book, and last week, the United States National Academies of Science put out a report on calling for more research into advancing solar geoengineering, which is like the ultimate technical fix of injecting aerosols into the atmosphere to cool the planet. So it's like another climate intervention at a global scale that's really scary and really dangerous because of the power dynamics, right? What it does is allow a few elites to have control over everyone else, and any technology that does that is not going to be overall be able to be applied in a socially just way. So I propose that instead of thinking about climate as a separate, discrete technical issue that needs to be solved, we should be thinking about energy democracy. And this is the view and a growing social movement of thinking about the transformation from fossil fuels to renewables is so much more than a technological switch. It is really about, it's an opportunity for us to reimagine and reinvest and redistribute power, literally and figuratively. So we can think about every community in the world actually has access to renewable resources, whether it be wind and solar. Coastal communities also may have wave and tidal and offshore wind. Inland communities also have geothermal, which is an energy source that we have not invested in, but it is also a renewable resource. And if we acknowledge that once we've invested for communities to own their renewable resource, own the technologies to leverage those resources, then the resource itself, the wind, the sun, the water, keeps coming, and it's actually abundant, it's perpetual, it's free. And it's so that's why it's really revolutionary to move towards renewables, because the source of the energy is much more distributed and can be lead to a more prosperous and equitable future for everyone. So we can base our investments in people and community, base our investments on social justice and human dignity, and really leverage the urgency of climate. The climate crisis does have an urgency, but we can leverage it for bigger societal transformations. So chapter 1 of my book, I talk about growing the squad. And the squad are these 4 junior congresswomen in the United States Congress that came on the national stage just 2.5 years ago. And they just changed the discourse on climate policy and energy policy, because what they did is they connected climate and energy with jobs and economic justice, with housing insecurity, and with structural racism and criminal justice reform. And for me, they kind of represent anti-racist feminist leadership, which is so desperately needed for us to achieve the transformative changes that we need. So anti-racist feminist leadership is leadership that is constantly aware of and responding to and resisting the problematic power dynamics of these structural systems that are continually privileging some and disadvantaging others. And it's about distributing wealth and power by investing in communities and reducing inequities and disparities by centering racial justice, economic justice, and social justice at every step along the way. And that's really about leveraging transformation by linking these problems together, not by separating them out. And obviously it's the antithesis of patriarchal leadership, right, that we had in the United States for 4 years, that is based on domination and intentionally excluding people. If you see this photograph, it's all men and they're all white. So not any representatives of people of color or any women. And they're very focused on continuing to concentrate their wealth and power. All the policies and priorities and practices and policies are with that in mind. And it's not about the public good. And it's about exacerbating inequities and racial gender disparities and denying the systemic problems that we have. So in order to sustain the status quo, this kind of leadership really just denies and say, oh, climate isn't a big problem. Oh, the pandemic isn't even that big of a problem. Or, you know, our economic crisis isn't a problem. Everything's fine. And telling people that everything's fine when it's not is a strategy to just keep things the same. So I'm not going to go through all the rest of my slides because I want to leave time to hear from the other great speakers and I want to have time for discussion. But I will just say that the rest of my book is actually elevating the stories and the examples of these amazing, innovative, creative leaders. So one chapter is all about leaders who are resisting the polluter elite. Jackie Patterson is the head of the NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and she and her team called out the fossil fuel industry and pointed out how they've manipulated Black communities in particular to get approval to have more fossil fuel infrastructure in these communities that then results in negative health disparities in those communities. And then the next chapter is about jobs and economic justice and a whole bunch of leaders who are connecting climate energy with investments in job training and economic justice and kind of resisting the precarity that we have become economic precarity that we've become accustomed to, and reclaiming the power of public investments and restructuring for a more inclusive prosperity. Then there's a whole bunch of leaders who've connected climate and energy with health and well-being. And again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to say, leaders that are pointing out how climate energy are integral to our health, and that health is has not been the priority necessarily with climate and energy, in part because of the whiteness of the environmental community in the United States, at least. And then transportation and housing are other areas that I focus on and give examples of leaders who are connecting climate and energy with housing. So I want to end by just saying that when I talk about leadership, I am really encourage us all to think about ourselves as leaders. Leadership isn't just elected officials and the CEOs of companies, right? Like, we can all be leaders and we can inspire others to act as leaders. And we really need to advocate for bigger systemic changes, right? And the evidence of that, especially right now during the pandemic, it's all being revealed how so many of our systems are just not serving people and not and actually perpetuating inequities and disparities, where we really need to switch that around. We need to understand and unlearn racism, sexism, and other problematic power dynamics that are being perpetuated all the time. And we can do that by prioritizing our awareness about these problematic power dynamics in everything we do. We can all get involved in advocating for local community renewable energy and leverage data and science and information for change. We can support cooperative models and novel economic structures and kind of connect across the divide by listening and learning to each other. So I'll end by pointing out Mary Robinson, climate justice leader internationally, and who has really just said we need a people's first approach, right? If we focus on what people need, none of this seems so radical, right? And I think rather than focusing on corporate interests. And I also honor Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black woman to run for president in the United States in 1972. We still haven't had a woman or a Black woman as president, but we're getting closer. And in some ways, people in 1972 probably thought that by now we might have. So we have come a long way, but we also have a long way still to go. So I will end there and just say that I think that these ideas are connected to kind of the degrowth conversations, because again, degrowth connects with this kind of people's first approach, right? Like, if you think about investing in ways that what people and communities need, you don't need this constant assumption of growth, which is mostly going to elites and not back to communities. So I will end there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very inspiring presentation, and especially thanks for setting the scene on our topic and making it clear once again that climate change is a very political issue. It's not just an ecological issue, which I think is the foundation to start any interesting and relevant discussion on this topic. So thank you very much. And I also want to apologize for going live a bit late. As I mentioned before, we were all stressed out with some technical issues at the start. So we got those solved, and I think we maybe went 10 minutes late. But anyway, that's solved. It's a learning curve still. And so next we're going to focus on the second part maybe of our title, which is challenging systemic violence in eco-modernist narratives. So we've set the systemic violence clear, and now let's look, with Seema, let's look at some of the discourses of the international institutions as well around critiques of these eco-modernist narratives. So thanks, Jennie, for mentioning some of the most popular technocratic solutions at the moment, and for setting it clear that perhaps we do need a counter narrative to this. And so I'll leave the floor to Seema. I'll do a short presentation of Seema as well. Seema is a professor and chair of rural development at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences with a focus on Europe. She works with questions of sustainability and justice in relation to environmental governance, climate politics, and rural development. Her work is shaped by the need to examine rural development in its particular situation, but in the context of wider transnational currents and relations. Feminist thinking and questioning of gender, race, ethnicity, class, and geography inform her work. Also issues of research approach, the doing of research, participatory research and ethics, and analysing environmental questions in a North-South perspective in the globalising context of environmental governance are also issues that she focuses on. So, Seema, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to try and share my screen. I hope it's going to work. It didn't last time. So if it doesn't, then I think Maxime said, no, it says open system preference. There's something wrong with my Zoom. So do you think Maxime could do it?
Yeah, Maxime is our technical supporter here. I think, yeah.
Yeah, he's doing it. Okay. So thank you for inviting me to this really interesting workshop and to your very exciting summer school. I've been listening to you and thinking, why didn't I have this when I was a doctorate student? It was not fair. So Maxime asked me to speak to a number of questions from my work, but broadly they touch upon the importance and the need for feminist thinking in questions of environmental governance and environmental justice, to be able to meet and go beyond the environmental and social justice challenges that we find ourselves in today. He hasn't shared it yet, right? No.
Yep, sorry, I'm managing the technical stuff. So the thing is, I have to restart Zoom to validate the changing in preferences. I have the same problem as you.
Okay, so maybe I just skip it then.
No, maybe you can go in the preferences, change the preferences. You just have to restart Zoom. I think it's better if you restart Zoom rather than me, because I have everybody connected to my account.
Okay, you know what? It's not that important. And my PowerPoints are not that good looking.
We can also do like this, if it's okay.
I'll do it without them. So anyway, and so as the title of the webinar indicates, one of the biggest challenges in environmental governance today, and that we're not really doing very well, is to address the structural and the systemic inequalities caused by the current paradigm, right? So that for me, two of the big problems are the question of violence and the question of care. But today I decided also to focus mainly on what I call the quiet politics of care. So I don't really mention violence so much today here. But I'm going to talk about what I call the quiet politics of care and how that is ignored in mainstream environmental governance, which actually causes a lot of violence across the board. So care, and that is care of people, animals, the environment, as we know, tends to be highly gendered, and it's also, of course, based on class, ethnicity, and race, and so on, in the sense of who does what and in what contexts, right? So for example, women who do the majority of the work at home, or people like in India who consider the lower caste to do the environmental care work, or even if you look at care work in the global north, that's performed by people of certain ethnicities or, and color. So it is obviously it's kind of infused with relationships of power. So, and it is this everyday work of care that makes lives possible all over in different places. But it tends to be, when it comes to the environment, it tends to be ignored in environmental decision making. And despite years of feminist research, mainstream environmental governance tends to regard questions of care as something that concerns the private sphere or the family, and not a question of environmental politics. So for example, in relation to forestry, where I've worked the most, and with forest groups in different parts of the world, it is clear that this inattention lies in the different meanings in what is considered to be work. So what is considered to be forest work is and what is not considered to be forest work is problematic. And also what is considered to be the right way to organize or the right way to act. So in my work, when I worked with forest groups, especially in India and Sweden, it was clear that the work that the women actually did in the environment tended to remain invisible. It wasn't really called work. So the real work was the work with the trees and the timber, which was called forest work. But the other work that the women did, for example, planting trees on the outskirts of the forest, or working in the forest, or collecting non-timber forest products, wasn't really considered work as such. And it was fairly invisible. when in both these places that I worked, it was when women finally actually tried to highlight the concerns, the fact that their work was not being taken into account. They did so by organizing themselves separately into women's groups and saying, you know, listen up, you're not looking at what we're doing. And this became very problematic because they were then overtly contradicting conventional ways of organizing. So when they organized, they were told, but we already have forest committees where you could join in. Why don't you just go there and take up the questions? And the problem was that there they felt they had no voice, which is why they were organizing. So they were doing two things wrong. One, they were being invisible. And when they sought to do something about it, they were doing it in the wrong way. And that was because in the normal ways of working in the everyday networks and organizations, the ways that they did organize, they tended to focus on multiple issues, right? So they didn't resemble the way a proper organization looked like. It wasn't just a forest committee, which was what most of the men were organized in. So they were in focused groups with one issue, whereas these women often had multiple issues that they took up. And they tried to show how they were connected. So from what I could see, and this was the case both in Sweden and in India, in fact, where they both tried to take up different issues, because as one of the women said, that, you know, we need to think about the larger thought. It's about the future of our communities or the future of our village. It's not just the question of the forest or just the climate, but it's something that needs to be looked at together. So from what I could see, it was clear that the women's groups in both places straddled the public and the private, right? So they didn't really see this distinction that we normally make. And they took action in the spaces in between the public, which was the forests, for example, or the village, and the private, which was the households. They brought it close to them. And, you know, these could include all kinds of activities, what they did in the home, but also in the community, like organizing village festivals and other activities, planting trees, fixing water tanks, which was seen as an extension of their homework, in a sense. So what they actually made clear with this work was that the public sphere is in practice indivisible from the private ethic of care, and that these activities that they did could not be separated from questions of forest governance. And like I said, this woman who said that, you know, we need to think the larger thought, or like another woman who told me in India that, you know, what is the point of us talking about protecting the forest when we can't protect ourselves? So they had taken up the question of violence in these committees as well. And they said, you know, and the people in the forest committees were like, this is nothing to do with with forests, you know, that's a question of violence. But for them, they said it doesn't really make sense to separate it. So there is this separation, and this goes through the whole system in a sense, because you don't see this underlying infrastructure around it and the underlying practices of environmental governance, actually. Unfortunately, this disregard for the work of care is also evident in climate programs today. So considerable research has shown that, especially in adaptation programs, for example, the labor-intensive work that is required for the climate programs, whether it's in relation to agriculture, water harvesting, and so on, tends to fall on women. Miriam Guiantaki, who works in Mexico, writes that, for instance, as part of a climate program, women were provided with wood stoves, compost bins, water cisterns, dry toilets, and so on. So everything that they thought should benefit them. When asked if they liked the technologies, many women replied, yes, they're great. But in fact, except for the water cisterns, not a single woman seemed to be using any of the eco-technologies. So for one, there was a total absence of understanding of women's everyday lives. And secondly, not involving them and the men in deciding on what they needed was doomed to fail. So this is when they totally ignored what they might want. But even in programs that actually direct attention to women's work, it can be problematic if the larger systemic inequalities are not addressed. So for example, we carried out studies in the climate programs in Burkina Faso. And the idea behind these you must have heard of the RED programs, the RED+. And the idea was that the men were not allowed to log trees, and that the women then could compensate for the lack of earnings with their work with the non-timber forest products. In this case, it was the shea trade that the women carried out in the villages informally with each other. And this was framed as a win-win for all. So you have carbon sequestration, where the global north is supporting the south, so they don't have to worry so much about what they're doing in their own home ground, but since they were concerned with carbon sequestration in the South. They saw it as poverty reduction, but also women's empowerment, because they were including them in markets and they were actually taking the share trade and formalizing it. So this attention to gender, which was basically attention to women's work, legitimized their program in relation to international donors. It made them look good because they were talking about gender in the climate programs. What this did was, of course, totally ignore the work of care that the women were already doing. So, they was now supposed to support the households by entering into markets. But the problem was that by entering into these markets, the women actually lost a great deal of control over their own trade. For the first thing, it was moved not only to the national level, but to in fact, the global, in the sense that they could no longer decide whom to sell to, how to sell, and where to be going with it. Also, as some of my colleagues working there have shown, as soon as women began to get involved in this organic and the fair trade in shea, they began to need to buy machinery, because you must have heard of L'Oreal that gets its fair trade, and they get well, L'Oreal is just one of the companies, but there are others that they write about. And what the women needed to do then was to buy special kind of machinery, which they could not have in their homes, and respond to several other demands by buyers in the global north, which meant that they couldn't work from home anymore as they did before, which was what actually that made their trade possible in the first place. So they could do multiple things at the same time. So as you can see, this all doesn't sound very hopeful. And I was asked by Maxime, so what can be done about this? And he said, how can the side effects be avoided? Though I'm not sure these are side effects. I think the problem is that these are intrinsic to the setup of the system, which takes for granted the labor of, there is this invisible labor that we don't see, and especially of care work. So to answer that, given all this, one could say, of course, there is a need to pay attention to the contextual factors in each place and how that would work, but also at the same time, the systemic inequalities in global markets. The question is, of course, how? And there are different ideas about this. And I'm also guessing that there are also, I'm not that sure, but I guess this also when it comes to degrowth, there are different ideas of how that should be done. Especially many decolonial scholars have argued for working from the outside. So they've said, we need to disengage from the structures of development that exist today. And they call upon like social movements and the huge diversity of groups working outside the mainstream. As for me, but for increasingly also having worked with local movement as well as bureaucracies, I feel that change needs to come from many places. And I think, for example, Jennie showed Jennie's examples were really interesting examples of when change comes or people try to affect change within the system. And I've argued as well that in some of, especially in papers on climate programs, and but also my work on gender mainstreaming, that why don't we also use the structures that exist to enact change? So not just discard them and disengage with them, but rather to use them for other purposes and to perhaps change them in this way slowly from the inside. And this is something I hope we can talk more about. I won't talk so much more now, but we could hopefully discuss more about this later. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, I think the last point about strategies is a very closely related point to the topic of conversation today, but perhaps it needs its own separate discussion. Let's see if it comes up in the questions later anyway. I definitely think it's a discussion worth having. Thanks a lot for the very interesting presentation again. I would have liked to see the slides and some of the pictures. And yeah, thanks for highlighting how these grassroots alternatives really do. I would call them alternatives. I don't know. I guess it's a bit of a, I don't know, development centric way of looking at it, maybe. But yeah, let's say alternatives to development discourse, and how they do criticize these sustainable development slogans of poverty reduction and women's empowerment, which are definitely words that get my blood boiling. So very interesting, thanks. Let's move on to Christie's presentation now. And yeah, I'll present the speaker now. Here we go. So Christie is a PhD candidate at Lund University, working as part of the Agenda 2030 graduate school. Her research is at the intersection of peace studies, climate science, and feminism. She addresses how peace can be climate resilient, examining how intersectionalities shape experiences of peace and climate change. Her background is in human rights advocacy with various community-based and international organizations, and in research on gender and climate topics for academic and policy relevant outputs. So Christie, I'll leave the floor to you.
Great, thanks very much. Let's see if I can have success sharing my screen. Okay. So hopefully you can see the main screen all right. Oops. I don't know if it's showing the full view. It looks like, yes. So thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to join the dialogue, and I've really enjoyed catching up on some of the previous guests that you've had on this series, and it's such an honor to be here today with these two excellent speakers. So thanks, Stephanie, for that introduction. As she mentioned, I'm a PhD student. So today I'll share a bit of the research that I'm doing as part of my doctoral studies. And a lot of this is actually based on an article published as part of my thesis. So it's very new and part of my ongoing thinking. And so I look forward especially to discussion that we can have afterwards. So my research is about how local communities are impacted by climate change and the implications of this for peace. And I'm interested in how gendered power structures relate to climate change. So I see the drivers, the experiences, and our responses to climate change as gendered, and I'm interested in the violences and peacefulness of this. And so I thought I would start by talking a little bit about peace, because it can mean many different things to different people. So I thought we could talk a little bit about what this could entail. And although there are many different ways to think about it, and to define what peace and peace studies are, generally in Europe, our sort of virtual setting for today and where I'm based, peace research is largely growing out of strands from peace activism, such as the anti-war movement in the 50s. And the field has, generally speaking, a normative basis, and a common thread through the different approaches are seeing peace as continuous and often as finding nonviolent or constructive means to deal with conflict, whether that means resolving it, managing, or maybe transforming relations between conflicting groups. And peace, as I said, of course, can mean many different things to different people. For example, the absence of war or the presence of well-being, perhaps processes of justice. So I think this speaks really well to sort of our topic for discussion today. And as we've already talked about kind of the politics of climate change and of leadership, peace is not a neutral concept, nor is it universal. And so this second point here about negative and positive peace are kind of two broad strands of peace that we can think about. So negative peace speaks more to the absence of physical or direct violence, And this is typically what we talk about when we think of a war ending in terms of peace. And then positive peace is looking beyond this, so entailing the negation of more structural violence. So if we take peace to mean not only the absence of war, but also the presence of some good in society, then we need to consider what structural violence is and what the negation of that would be. And this is the type of peace that I am mainly researching and trying to understand in the context of climate change. So just a quick note maybe on structural violence and how I see it. In the research that this is based on, I was looking at structural violence in terms of both resources and power. So distribution of resources, looking, for example, at equal access to assets or capacities such as wealth, maybe time, food, natural resources, and so on. And power, I look at more discursively. So the influence that an actor might be able to access or engage with to realize their intentions. And how this is experienced looks differently for different people, and it is contextual. So I find that feminist theory has been particularly helpful for me in understanding and trying to analyze structural violence and peace. So my approach mainly builds on feminist research and feminist peace, which is, again, explicitly normative, and it's oriented in critique and centered on transforming gendered power relations toward a peaceful society. So I have a lot to build on, I think, from Seema's research and the presentation that you made today. Feminist peace helps us to highlight how intersecting oppressions shape global social conditions. So meaning that through focusing on these conditions, we come to know other ways of understanding harm and grievances. So through this approach, gender is, we can understand it to be implicated in all forms of violence, including, for example, colonial histories, geographies, and different ways of knowing. And in particular, this approach to peace helps us to look at how various violences can overlap. So this is where intersectionality comes in for me, looking at factors such as a person's gender, or maybe race, class, ability, age, nationality, depending on context, of course, other factors as well, how these overlap with societal power structures, or maybe are shaped by or reinforce power structures, and the different privileges or oppressions that emerge at the intersection of these identities, and how this might factor into inequalities that can amount to structural violence. So this view of peace as both intersectional and positive helps us think about who, both within and between groups of people in a society, is experiencing vulnerabilities or perhaps resilience, and helps us to think about the extent to which this is experienced in society. So who and to what extent? And this is part of a shift within feminist peace and other strands of focusing beyond the quote unquote spectacular forms of violence and grounding on a broader spectrum of human experiences. So including more everydayness and possibilities of peaceful coexistence. And as part of this, I think it's important to keep in mind, because this is context dependent, there isn't a single or maybe an ultimate peace outcome, that it's dynamic and relational in the context in which it occurs. So all of this is my basis for considering how peace relates to climate change. And I think the extent to which peace is climate resilient necessitates both that peace does not contribute to climate change and that people can experience peace through a changing climate. So peace depends not only on responses to climate shocks, but also on the extent to which societies can address problems of social inequality and violent power structures. And in the paper that I'm referencing today, I explore how degrowth can help us see how this might be possible. So I have a degrowth framework that's based on foundations of ecological aspects and synergies between the concepts of peace and degrowth. So to get a little bit more into that, the starting point for this was actually considering the SDGs as part of the Agenda 2030 graduate school that was mentioned. I was looking at the agenda, and we know that the 2030 agenda is considered to be a holistic approach where we can, they outline 17 goals. So here I have pictured 3 of them. And through this holistic approach, we're supposed to be able to address peace alongside climate goals and economic growth, that we can have all of these together. And my research stems from sort of questions raised by these overlaps or gaps in theoretical and empirical findings between sort of these 3 aspects. And so I'll look at sort of the overlaps between these 3, and then talk a bit about the connection to degrowth. So this visual is just a starting point, I think, to help us discuss maybe peace and security and how they've been looked at. And studies have looked at the relationship between climate and peace, but mainly through a lens of violent conflict, which follows a trend in peace research more generally, looking at armed conflict and wars rather than more positive conceptualizations of peace. And some of this focus, I think we can say, stems from correlations and particular ontologies of peace and violence. So these maps speak to that, to the aspect of correlations, of showing a global distribution of armed conflict and states that are considered to be vulnerable to climate change. And since around 2007, when we had the IPCC's fourth assessment report, we've seen more discussions of climate change as a security issue, sort of related to the last slide, the image that I showed. So for decades now, we've heard warnings that climate change will induce scarcity of resources, displace mass populations, and increase the risk of violent conflict. But despite these suggestions, research hasn't found such a general effect. And that doesn't mean that climate can never play a role, but that climate change is more likely perhaps to aggravate existing conflicts or maybe impact the dynamics. But what I'm interested in is the aspect of vulnerability and how power structures impact people who are affected by climate change and sort of the extent of that. So we know that there are differentiated vulnerabilities, and I won't say too much about that now, I think, but to the extent that we know from research that social and political factors affect people's vulnerability to climate change, maybe more so than the physical climate event itself. And so taken together, these studies on climate and peace and vulnerability help motivate a conceptualization for peace that accounts for resources and power, this type of positive peace that I introduced earlier. So turning then to the issue of economic growth, many sort of existing political and also scholarly frameworks for advancing peace don't always acknowledge the complex links to climate change. So economic growth has traditionally, maybe in more mainstream circles, has been seen as essential to raising living standards and reducing poverty, and has been seen as key to building and maintaining peace. And I'm sure this is quite a familiar narrative to many of us. So we have, for example, some research that has linked low income levels or slow economic growth to conflict between or within states. But others have pointed to more complex pathways or linkages. So showing that economic growth might have the opposite result, and that any peaceful effects of economic growth might depend on other societal factors, that it might not be the economic growth itself that is having this benefit. So regardless of this sort of ambiguity in the findings, which I talk a bit more about in the article, we know that there are well-founded examples of harmful patterns of growth. So it's not just that we're unclear about the benefits, but also that we know there's harm both to nature and of course to human societies. We have examples, for instance, from Maria Mies about capitalist systems that are inherently based on exploitation and are built on externalizing human and environmental well-being. And one example of that we can see in the concept of market violence, which is inflicting physical harm, leaving situations of vulnerability and damaging the environment in the market locality through global supply chains. We also know that despite trends of increased gains in capitalist systems, that inequalities not only persist, but are rising, as shown here, and as Jennie talked about earlier. And so in addition to seeing inequalities rise, we can also look at how economic growth has jeopardized social cohesion, and quality of life only improves up to a certain threshold. So while there may be benefits of growth, those might be seen only up to a certain point, that after that, it really, we don't see further benefits. We also see challenges of growth, of course, linked to the environment. And I think maybe keeping an eye on time, I might not say so much here because I guess this is maybe more familiar to a degrowth audience. But essentially, degrowth is the idea that we can have continued economic growth or green growth using green energy sources to continue economic growth, and that decoupling is saying we can continue to have that economic growth without the negative impacts. And so the question is whether that's possible, and research has shown that it may not only be challenging, but potentially impossible. So that we might only be able to achieve those goals in the short term and in some nations. So maybe at best a temporary fix and potentially infeasible on a global scale or in the long term. So my questions then, sort of taking all of this together, is how can peace be climate resilient, and how can peace and environmental sustainability align? So the framework that I present is sort of drawing together lessons from degrowth and bringing examples of where we might see seeds of degrowth benefits for peace. So these unfortunately aren't case studies, but I think they provide important examples of seeing how this might work and helping to make this a bit less abstract. So the first possibility that I look at is moving beyond structural violence through redistribution. So we know that in many of our communities, resources and power are held disproportionately. So some are in positions of privilege while others are at a disadvantage, either politically or in terms of maybe economic wealth or leisure time, or with the distribution of other resources. And so the example that I look at of what redistribution is and how it could look like is through urban gardening. And I illustrate this, how it's linked to peace, through an example in Detroit in the US. And some of the benefits that were seen through urban gardening initiatives were not only material, but also some of these more political aspects. So the gardens provide health benefits, both through impacting the environment, so filtering air and water, preventing soil erosion, but also through healthy food and access to food for low-income families, and by impacting how food is obtained and distributed. And other benefits were strengthening neighborhood relations, fostering a sharing of space and responsibilities, political agency, employment opportunities, and so on. And so this example helps us look at how urban gardening can move beyond structural violence by providing food resources to improve well-being and by redistributing power at a community level. The second case that I want to talk about, or example, is reprioritizing care and how this can help us disrupt harmful power structures. So care work, which Seema has already talked really nicely about, includes actions that underline the quote unquote formal economy. And an example of a degrowth practice that I look at for doing this is basic income. And this can help balance household power, not only linked to gender, but also to income, education, ethnicity, or race. And on a societal level, it can also challenge the divide between receivers and givers. So there are also potential environmental benefits of this, for example, limiting harmful emissions through reducing the consumption of status goods or bringing more people to a modest expenditure level, which has been shown to have environmental impacts as well, positively. And the example here was from Dauphine in Canada in the 1970s, where they provided basic income to the community. And the focus here is not on gender equality in terms of paid work, but on a revaluation process of care that disrupts harmful power structures and helps to meet material needs of those who are taking the responsibility for care work. So disrupting labor hierarchies and revaluing care. And last but not least, I also think there's potential here for decolonizing peace through global equity. And the focus here is on structural aspects of inequality in the global system, and looking at the fact that those who contribute the least to climate change are likely to suffer the most negative impacts, which we have heard a lot, quite a bit, I think. So the example that I take here is with wealth caps. So to put a ceiling on how much an individual can amass, and to help curb growth linked to drivers of climate change. So this approach is looking at the potential to dismantle hierarchies of exploitation and to detangle countries and communities from harmful changes of production and consumption. So not only from maybe the global north to the global south, but also looking at communities within the quote unquote global north and where these inequalities exist and how we might curb unsustainable lifestyles, hold maybe the biggest and the richest emitters responsible, and address these inequalities. So I think I will end there. This has been part of my work to try to envision a more peaceful future. This image is also drawing on the work of Mary Robinson, which Jennie has already referenced earlier today, and looking at the pursuit of peace and processes of peace that keep questions of intersectionality at the forefront. So thank you very much. These are the links to the original text and blog post, which I think is a bit more digestible for a quick read. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Great. So I think we've made the point clear then that that there is structural violence at the heart of the reasons why we have climate change, and that climate change also in its effects is also causes further inequality. I'm also glad that we managed to talk about environmental justice as well a bit, and not focus it all on climate, which was originally the direction I wanted to take with this webinar, because I think it's useful to look at the two together. So I think I received one question, which I will address to Christie. Seeing the reluctance of most politicians to question the growth paradigm, how hopeful are you that degrowth ideas will gain traction in the near future?
Bit of a tricky question, I guess. Personally, I think we have to be optimistic. And what do we have if we don't have hope? I myself am maybe more involved with local initiatives. And so then I find it quite hopeful, because I think a lot of the maybe concepts or processes of degrowth we see in a lot of places, but maybe not called that. So I think a lot of people relate to them or would be interested in these activities and processes, even if they're not called degrowth. So I think as long as we're getting the point, that's what's important. And I have seen the specifically maybe degrowth cropping up more recently in EU documents and proposals, and the fact that we have more than one summer school on degrowth, and that we have other courses and conferences and things like this, I think is really encouraging. And maybe one of the more hopeful examples is when we have these types of conferences, that it's not just academic discussions, which I obviously think are really important, but also that we talk about activism and try to engage communities more broadly. So I find it really hopeful. And I think there are examples that of stories that we can highlight and uplift that are promising this way.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
I guess I would just kind of build off what Christie mentioned, that not all policies and practices and priorities that are consistent with degrowth use that word degrowth, right? So similarly with energy democracy, which is a whole area that I study, there are a lot of people doing things that I would consider, in the realm of energy democracy, but people aren't familiar with that term, right? So, so I don't think we have to worry so much about the words and the framing all the time, and we also want to be encouraging and inclusive. So I think we can see, obviously, with in the politicians' language, like the inconsistencies oftentimes, and we know where that's coming from, so we can kind of accept it, that that's predictable, that what some politicians will say, and still some of those same people may actually also support some innovative approaches that are not consistent with that, because it's just so mainstream, the growth paradigm, that I think I guess it's kind of similar to Christie, of being, a little bit optimistic and looking for opportunities for synergy rather than kind of hoping for bigger transformational language, at this stage.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we have another question from the chat. I am not sure I think this is very specific, maybe. I'm not interpreting it properly. I'll read it out anyway. Do you know any examples of moving beyond structural violence in the global south? So I would direct this at Seema, giving the presentations we've had. And yeah, if you have an idea of how to answer that question, go for it. If not, I would say, yeah, you've given one example, and maybe, answer this question maybe from the points of where do you see it most hopeful, the most hopeful place of it coming from a more like grassroots, or if there's any possibility of it the international institutions' role being in some way possibly helpful for this, you know, without obviously criticizing them, but what's the role to play, I guess?
Well, yeah, I would say that, well, like you pointed out, and I guess what Jennie and Christie spoke about earlier as well, that there are things happening all around us. And there are, I mean, whether it's called energy democracy or other groups, there are things going on. And especially in the global south, there is a great deal going on, especially at the grassroots, that doesn't always make itself to the mainstream, or it doesn't even make itself into the discussion on what we should be doing. So I think there is something that is challenging things. That said, I would also like to say that it's important that we don't make this distinction between the mainstream and the grassroots, and that, you know, there is a clear-cut distinction between them, because today it's very difficult to say who is within the system and who is out of it. I mean, even when you are totally out of it, in a way you're still part of it. You know, you take in some things. There are some practices which you're part of, and some that you're not. So I would say, which is why I said earlier that I think it needs to be done in many different ways. And I think in a sense, the agreement around the Sustainable Development Goals in 2016 was heartening, because that was the point where so many people did agree on certain, both NGOs and others at least, and civil society organizations along with others did agree on certain goals that they wanted to carry out. The fact that the Sustainable Development Goals were actually prompted by countries in the global south, I think it was Colombia and Guatemala maybe, some initially, that kind of pushed it, also shows that, you know, there is a change, there are changes happening. It's not this what we always, I mean, we like to talk in, it's easier when we talk in black and white, right? Or big, like draw lines across, but I think there is a lot happening. And I think that's where, and the change will come. It'll come from the grassroots, but also I think from others. And for instance, in the groups, the women's groups that I spoke about, one of the reasons that they were able to take up some of the concerns was because Oxfam, which is an international organization, was supporting, in a small way, they were supporting the forest groups. And according to Oxfam, they had an evaluation. And of course, the evaluator said, oh, but there are no women in this huge movement. So what are the women doing? So Oxfam started this, gave them some support. And at that time, of course, what was really popular was, so they started women's groups where women could come and do tailoring, have tailoring classes. Or they also eventually, when they went into the 90s, they started organizing microcredit groups, which was, you know, the same again, where you just use these programs and say, oh, look, we have gender. But the good thing that came out of this was that several women took the groups that I spoke about, they took this opportunity and organized themselves. And they started talking about things beyond tailoring or beyond the microcredits. They started taking up questions of violence. They started taking up questions of, you know, asking where the budgets were being spent. So this gave them the space to do things. I don't know if it's necessarily meant by Oxfam to do that, but actually they did respond to gendered concerns in that way for a short while, until, of course, they had to shut it down. But still, so I think this insistence on gender, though a lot of people have criticized gender mainstreaming for it having been co-opted, it does also open up spaces sometimes inadvertently, and sometimes, you know, with doing what it's meant to do. It's like there's an Indian scholar who calls it, like, all the programs that the Indian government has for women's groups. She said it's like, you know, getting them to shake the tiger's tail, because I mean, it's like getting the women to actually organize against the state, because that's what they're doing. They're supporting the women. And so I don't, it's like I said, so it comes from many different places. And I think it is happening at all levels as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, I'll go with the next question. Hello, how do you think a care income could bring decolonial peace and degrowth? I might address this to Christie, considering you mentioned a bit more the policy area, or if anybody else wants to answer, go for it. Maybe Jennie as well, I don't know. It didn't address it to anybody specifically, so I'm going to go with Christie myself.
Yeah, sure. I can at least maybe start us off. Be interested to hear what the others might have to say. I guess at least in my research, I understand peace as a process and decolonizing work as an important part of this. And the chains of production and consumption that we have in the global economy include care work, that it's not just material goods, but also care work and care values. And so I think basic income and the processes of reprioritizing care that I mentioned and valuing care work, we can think of as part of this maybe process towards decolonizing and moving towards global equity that would be essential for this kind of peace that I've talked about, or that I see as aligning with degrowth processes. So I see basic, if that was the question, right, about care income, and not specifically basic income, but I guess care income as helping us to detangle this by providing the material benefits for revaluing care, and that this can help detangle the power hierarchies that exist within communities and are also displacing a lot of care value and labor in the global economy. So I see a lot of overlap, I guess, between those processes of decolonizing and revaluing care.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I also personally think the strength of the care income is also kind of in a provocative way, as I think maybe Silvia Federici points out. I think it's it kind of in a provocative way highlights how the capitalist growth system will fall apart without valuing care work properly, because it extracts it for free and it can't. Were you putting your hand up? Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe I can just add a recommendation on Stefania Barca's new book, Forces of Reproduction. That is a really nice look at this for anyone who might be interested on this topic specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And let me just read the chat. Okay, so there's a debate between feminism and decolonialism for the last decades. How are we going to address this issue? Is there a specific question, Maxine, related to this? Okay, it was related to the care income. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to form that into a question, so I'm just going to leave it. And okay, so we don't have any more questions, I don't think, unless any more appear in the YouTube chat. But it's 6:30.
I could say something. I'm not sure what this person means about the debates about feminism and decolonialism, but if one could think that, you know, a lot of the ground that, I mean, white feminism has been criticized for not being intersectional, for example, and, you know, not thinking about intersecting dimensions of power. But at the same time, the kind of, you know, the current structures have enabled certain feminists, mainly white, but even otherwise, into kind of solidarity, kind of global solidarity through the existing structures. For example, you know, the women's conferences, and which is also the same structure, right, of development, and it has enabled certain feminist gains to be made in different parts of the world. So in that sense, I would say the structures have enabled women to come forward in many places. Also, for example, in places doing development in the global south, where there's always this talk about that patriarchal oppressed women. And the thing is that, yeah, women are oppressed in many places, and sometimes development initiatives have helped them get out of it, in a sense, or not get out, but at least challenge some structures. So in that sense, if you think about decolonialism that asks to disengage from the structures completely, one could think maybe that it does not necessarily mean that it is in the interest of women in many places. So in that sense that, yeah, then they are at cross purposes. But I mean, that's kind of simplifying it, I suppose. But the question, there's no question to it, right? I mean, I was just thinking that could be what the person was thinking. So
yeah, it's often a guessing game with the questions. I think it was related to the one before, yeah, but I'm going to accept that as a good response. Okay, so why don't we finish with a wrap up of final thoughts? If you want to react to each other's presentations as well, now's the time. And just anything, just a final note to finish on if you want, even if it's of one phrase.
No, I'd just like to say thank you. I thought it was really interesting, and I'm going to read your book and your articles. So thank you for your presentations also.
Yeah, similarly, I was just going to say thank you for bringing us together, and a very interesting discussion and conversation, and nice to meet you virtually, Seema and Christie and Stephanie.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks everyone so much. It was really a pleasure to learn from you today and to be part of the conversation.
Great.
And good luck with the summer school.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll take the occasion to remind everybody that anybody watching, that if you want to apply for the summer school, which will happen in the end of June, beginning of July, make sure you apply before the 10th of April, which is when we're going to close the application period. And in the meantime, we'll keep on with these online webinars until June. And so check out our Facebook and Twitter and YouTube channels for more updates on our next upcoming online seminars.
Can I ask a question about school? What if if it's impossible to travel, so will you still have those summer schools will you have it online, or?
We're currently thinking about how to put it online. Yeah, at the moment we're counting on the fact that at least some extent of mobility will be possible. We're just going to have to wait and see. It's very uncertain. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Cool. Maxime, have you ended the
Yep,
stream?
Tati's doing it.
Great.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Oh, that was stressful.